Welcome to a new session in which you'll become acquainted with yet another great classic work of literature. This time, the narrative poem, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, written in 1798 by Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Coleridge was an important English Romantic poet, as well as an essayist and philosopher. He is always associated with his fellow poet and good friend William Wordsworth, with whom he collaborated on many works, including The Ancient Mariner. Coleridge was a searcher and an idealist whose life, as you will soon see, was politically, socially, and creatively very active. He spent part of that life trying to conceptualize and organize a utopian society that would discourage evil and promote the fellowship of humankind. He was part of a philosophical movement that opposed the empiricism of 18th century Britain, empiricism being the belief that knowledge is gained through experience and observation, and instead advocated a system based on German thinkers that regarded the mind as active rather than passive, and put more value on imagination and creativity. The Rime of the Ancient Mariner was published in a volume entitled The Lyrical Ballads, which contained 4 poems by Coleridge and 19 by Wordsworth, and is considered a central work in the Romantic period of English literature. The book, published anonymously, opened with The Rime of the Ancient Mariner and closed with Wordsworth's Tintern Abbey. Other Coleridge poems included were The Foster Mother's Tale, The Dungeon, and The Nightingale. The entire volume was an experiment in poetic subject matter and diction, and the authors hoped, in their words, to ascertain how far the language of conversation in the middle and lower classes of society is adapted to the purposes of poetic pleasure. In other words, could the common talk of the common man be translated into good poetry? An advertisement of The Ancient Mariner run at the time said, "The Rime of the Ancient Mariner was professedly written in imitation of the style as well as the spirit of the elder poets. But with a few exceptions, the author believes that the language adopted in it has been equally intelligible for these last 3 centuries. The Ancient Mariner is a narrative poem that uses the techniques of old ballads. The poem itself was also planned with the help of William Wordsworth, who contributed several lines and ideas, some of which Coleridge specifically identified. But the bulk of the work and its driving inspiration came from Coleridge himself. Most of the story takes place on a sailing ship traveling the seas, sometime in the late medieval period. The narrator of the tale is an ancient mariner or seaman, who commits an almost motiveless crime by killing a harmless albatross that has befriended the ship and crew. Thereafter he undergoes nothing but bad luck and disaster, and is condemned to a life in death. He is pursued relentlessly until he repents, at which point supernatural powers carry his ship back to port. But for the rest of his life, he must do penance by telling his story to others, and teaching them the lesson he himself has learned, to love and revere all things that God has created and loves himself. Some people believe the poem or ballad is autobiographical in its strange and imaginative theme. Coleridge was plagued by remorse for his addiction to opium, a drug he'd originally taken to relieve the pain of his rheumatism. Whether or not the poem was created as a catharsis for his own guilt hardly matters. Its rich imagery, haunting storyline, and emotional power stand by themselves. Coleridge's work always reflected an interest in the exotic and supernatural, which he tried to make more accessible to his readers by using the simple, straightforward language we mentioned earlier, in the quaint and archaic English ballad form. Although The Ancient Mariner is not a lengthy work, it succeeds at making the extraordinary believable, and its mixture of beauty and horror touches every one of our senses and feelings. The poetic innovations of Coleridge and Wordsworth were important and had far-reaching consequences. Most other poetry of the 18th century used an even meter, with a specific number of syllables in each line. But in the lyrical ballads, Coleridge and Wordsworth broke free from this pattern, varying the number of syllables in each line and the placement of the accent in each line. This change in traditional meter gave their work a quality of freedom, spontaneity, and flow that affected and complemented their subject matter. That subject matter was also new and inventive. Coleridge himself made many comments about the new form of poetry he and Wordsworth were trying to write, and some of these can enrich our understanding of their work. The two men spent many hours discussing the purpose and direction of poetry, and these discussions led them to the decision to write and publish a volume of poems in which they would abandon traditional technique and subject matter to present a more forceful and elemental view of human emotions. They summed up their goal this way: the power of exciting the sympathy of the reader by a faithful adherence to the truth of nature, and the power of giving the interest of novelty by the modifying colors of imagination. This idea led to the plan of the lyrical ballads, in which it was Coleridge's task to make credible the supernatural and wonderful. As is often the case with innovative writers, their work was met with little praise at the time. Lyrical ballads was not only not greeted as the herald of a new age in English poetry, it was soundly condemned. Coleridge's wife remarked that the lyrical ballads are laughed at and disliked by all, with very few accepted. To complete this experiment in poetry, Coleridge went through many preparations and revisions. For its second edition, which appeared 2 years after the first, he eliminated many words that seemed too archaic and deleted a total of about 40 lines. He also changed the title to The Ancient Mariner, a Poet's Reverie. 2 years after that, he made even more modifications in the poem, and this is the version that is available to modern readers. As might be expected, Coleridge himself had a fascinating life, and he was a complex man and a profound thinker. We know much about his life because of the vast amount of letters and some autobiographical material he wrote. It's his early life that is most interesting, at least from a literary point of view, because Samuel Coleridge had written all his great works of poetry by the time he was only 30 years old. He was born on October 21st, 1772, in the town of Ottery St. Mary, England. His father, John Coleridge, was an educated and very religious man, vicar of the parish, master of a grammar school, and chaplain priest of a college. Samuel was the youngest of his father's 4 children, but his stepmother brought 10 more children to the marriage. He was close to his father, who hoped he'd enter the ministry, and was very much like him. John Coleridge was a talented mathematician. He spoke Latin, Greek, and several Oriental languages, and he wrote several works, although few were published. Coleridge once said his father, whom he admired greatly, was not a first-rate genius, but he was a first-rate Christian. Within that large family, Coleridge was somewhat lonely, and his older brothers in particular had little interest in associating with him. He spent much of his time alone and became a voracious reader, who often acted out what he read. His favorite adventure was to go to his aunt's house in Crediton, because she had a large and wondrous treasury of books. He was especially taken by the Arabian Nights. Adults who encountered the young Coleridge were struck by his precocity and the range and depth of his conversation. His father, who put him in school at the vicarage, was his only intellectual companion, but unfortunately he died when Samuel was only 9 years old. After his father died, Coleridge began his formal education. He was unhappy with his father's replacement at the vicarage, whom he said made frequent mistakes in grammar. So he left to attend Christ's Hospital in London, where he also visited an uncle who took the boy along on his frequent visits to coffee houses and taverns. His discussions of ideas and issues were so profound that at only age 10, his reputation as Coleridge the Talker was already established. At Christ's Hospital he was lonely at first, but later attracted a large number of friends and admirers who enjoyed his gripping conversation. He continued his broad reading habits, reading every book in the King Street Library. Coleridge rapidly made his way through Christ's Hospital and then entered university training. It was in this year, 1787, that he began his work as a poet, composing several minor works that nonetheless suggested his future direction and skill. Coleridge was a brilliant but undisciplined student, whom a teacher once referred to as that sensible fool, Coleridge. Around this time, Coleridge met the Evans family and became romantically interested in Mary Evans, one of 3 sisters. Sadly, his interest over the years was far greater than hers, and when she finally rejected him, it took a long time for him to recover emotionally. He once wrote to his friend Robert Southey, "I loved her, Southey, almost to madness." It was while attending Cambridge that Coleridge first came under the spell of opium, although it wouldn't become a debilitating habit until 1803, when he was 31 years old. 1803 was a particularly difficult year for him, and his notebook entries show a great deal of emotional and physical agony. But the first accounts of his use of opium date back to 1793, when he was a student, and used it to relieve a rheumatic condition. In these days, opium was a commonly administered drug that was acquired with little difficulty. Coleridge continued to use opium over the years, at first for physical pain, but later for what was obviously psychic pain, and he suffered with remorse that it had contributed to his creative downfall. While at Cambridge, Coleridge was spending large amounts of money and borrowing from his brothers. He spent more time drinking, talking, and carousing than he did on his academic work, and was accumulating large debts. At this time, he became involved in what could be called revolutionary politics, aligning himself with dissenters to the Church of England. This wasn't incongruent with his developing Romanticism, since Romanticism and the Romantic period itself were a form of rebellion. Romantic poets rebelled against traditional poetic diction, against orthodox theology, and against accepted ideas about human perception. Coleridge actually wrote several political poems, but they're not well known, and he never took his ideas as far as revolutionary action. Because of his growing debts and the exasperation of his generous brothers, and probably also because of his disappointment in love, Coleridge entered the King's Regiment of the Dragoons. But he was not suitable material for the cavalry, and in fact couldn't even stay on a horse. He enlisted in December and was out by the following February. During this time, Coleridge was beset by guilt over how he'd wasted his opportunities, and had had to go to his brothers for help. The following summer, he became friends with a man who would play an important role in his life. His name was Robert Southey, and he was a fellow poet who would become Coleridge's brother-in-law and co-organizer of his utopian society. Coleridge was 22 when he met Southey, and Southey was 20. They shared each other's views and a mutual admiration. Southey was gripped by Coleridge's commanding personality, and Coleridge was taken with Southey's enthusiasm for putting some of the ideas of Plato's Republic into action by creating an ideal community. These two men, along with a group of other select Englishmen, designed a community they called Pantasocracy, which they hoped to build along the Susquehanna River in America. The goal of this community was to eliminate greed by abolishing private ownership, including a ban on private property. Coleridge wrote, "Wherever men can be vicious, some will be. The leading idea of Pantasocracy is to make men necessarily virtuous by removing all motives to evil, all possible temptations. There, all men would share a common aim. There would be common labor for a common harvest, domestic peace, expanding knowledge, and the best environment possible for raising children." In his enthusiasm for this plan, Coleridge even married Sarah Fricker, the sister of the woman to whom Southey was engaged, because she and her family were avid supporters of Pantasocracy and planned to join the community. However, after many lecture tours and not unsuccessful attempts to raise money and support, Southey and Coleridge became estranged. Southey's approach to the project was practical and disciplined, while Coleridge continued on in a passionate, idealistic line until the partnership finally ruptured and Coleridge moved with his new wife to Celadon. There he wrote one of his best works, the Aeolian Harp. He then began publication of a political newsletter with the motto, "That all may know the truth and that the truth may make us free." But it failed after a few months. Coleridge now had a wife who was mostly unwell, a new son, and almost no money. He considered the ministry for a brief time and began to sermonize at local churches to test his skills. It was about this time that Coleridge met a young poet named William Wordsworth, and the two would form a friendship that would make literary history. Both shared a deep passion for poetry and many profound ideas, although they also had their differences. William and his sister Dorothy moved 35 miles to be near Coleridge, and they spent many idyllic months walking, reading poetry, conversing, and writing. The Wordsworths and Coleridge began to develop together a passionate interest in nature and a search for religious or spiritual meaning in the works of nature. Wordsworth admired Coleridge greatly, and once said, "His is the power of throwing out in profusion grand central truths, from which might be evolved the most comprehensive systems. By now, Coleridge had accepted an annuity from a couple who admired his talent, and finally free from financial worry, he began to create his greatest works. In 1798, in only 1 year, he wrote France, an Ode, Frost at Midnight, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, Fears of Solitude, The Nightingale, and Kubla Khan. These works, along with the poem Christabel, established his reputation as a poet and brought him international fame. This year had come to be known as Coleridge's Annus Mirabilis, which translated from the Latin means wonderful year. It was also during this time that Coleridge and Wordsworth published Lyrical Ballads, the cooperative volume that included both their works and opened with The Ancient Mariner. They had conceived the idea of this poem while on a walking tour, and originally intended to write it together, but Coleridge soon took over the work, which was a type he did best, and incorporated only a few of Wordsworth's suggestions. After publication of Lyrical Ballads, the Wordsworths and Coleridge planned an extended stay in Germany. While there, Coleridge studied philosophy, particularly Kant, and underwent a change of interest and focus that would affect his work from there on. He shifted to more philosophical and theological themes, and never again wrote works like Kubla Khan or The Ancient Mariner. He also heard news of the death of his infant son, his second child. Unhappy in his marriage, Coleridge fell in love with Sarah Hutchinson, whose sister Wordsworth later married. His marital woes were only part of his difficulties at this time. He was by then addicted to opium and aware that his poetic talent was fading. In 1802, at the age of 30, he published the last of his great poems, Dejection, an Ode. From then on, he concentrated on politics, religion, philosophy, and literary criticism. After a stay in Malta to improve his health, he returned to England and separated from his wife. In 1810, the remarkable and notable friendship of Coleridge and Wordsworth was abruptly ended through a misunderstanding about a remark Wordsworth had made about Coleridge's personal habits. Coleridge interpreted it differently than it had been intended, and the two never reconciled. From 1816 until his death 18 years later, he lived in London under the supervision of a doctor who helped him gain control of his addiction. His home became a center for admirers and literary aspirants, and was called the Oracle of Highgate, Highgate being the section of London in which he lived. He continued to write and to give public lectures, chiefly on literary subjects and criticism. Samuel Taylor Coleridge died at age 62 on July 25, 1834, the year after he'd written his own epitaph. It read, "Lift one thought in prayer for S.T.C., that he who many a year with toilsome breath found death in life, may here find life in death." That epitaph of Coleridge evokes one of the major themes of his masterpiece poem, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, the theme of a life lived in death. It's time now to hear the story of the mariner and how that theme and others are played out. But first, let's consider the major characters, of which there are very few. The central character is, of course, the ancient mariner, a seafarer who has an incredible supernatural experience as a result of his mindless slaying of an innocent albatross. Unlike traditional heroes, the mariner is rather a passive character who reacts far more than he acts. The fact that he never develops as a full, distinct personality was one of Wordsworth's criticisms of the poem, but to others it makes no difference in the impact of the story. Another character is the wedding guest. He's a man on his way to a wedding when he's commandeered by the ancient mariner, who wants to tell him his story. The mariner has been condemned to go through the rest of his life telling this story to strangers, although these strangers are not chosen arbitrarily, but rather by some special quality the mariner sees in their faces. The wedding guest is first intrigued, then very moved by the story, and he never does make it to the wedding. The crew of the mariner's ship is also considered jointly as a major character, since they are also punished by the deed he commits, and their interactions with the mariner make some interesting points about guilt and blame and how humans deal with them. The albatross is a symbolic character representing nature and all of God's creatures and man's guilt. The albatross is white and has sometimes been compared to the whale in Moby Dick. Finally, there is a hermit whom the mariner seeks at the end of the poem, who represents salvation, redemption, forgiveness, and God himself. The poem opens with a description of the scene. An elderly, gray-haired sailor approaches three young gentlemen on their way to a wedding celebration. One of the men, next of kin to the bridegroom, is singled out to hear his story. First the old man grabs him with his skinny hand, but then the hypnotic glance of his glittering eye holds the guest instead. He says, "O wedding guest, this soul hath been alone on a wide, wide sea, so lonely 'twas that God himself scarce seemed there to be." At first the wedding guest resents this intrusion, but he soon feels compelled to listen to the story, which is indeed remarkable. The wedding guest is captive to the building suspense, responding with fear and then horror as the story unfolds. The first words of the mariner's story are, "There was a ship." This ship leaves its harbor and sets a southerly course for the line. As the ship sails clear of the harbor and out to the open sea, there is no apprehension among the crew that day. But several days out, a storm arises, and its mighty winds blow the ship steadily south, towards the South Pole. Soon it enters what is described as the land of ice and of fearful sounds, where no living thing was to be seen. A great sense of helplessness and foreboding comes over the crew, and so it is with much relief that they then spy an enormous seabird, a great white albatross, flying through the fog towards the ship. The ancient mariner says, "As if it had been a Christian soul, we hailed it in God's name." The crew feeds the albatross, and then the helmsman successfully maneuvers the ship through the ice. The albatross is taken as a good omen. As the ship turns and heads northward, the bird faithfully follows. But soon the bird's constant presence starts to unnerve the mariner, and he shoots it with his crossbow. He's shocked at his own alarming deed. "God save thee, ancient mariner, from the fiends that plague thee thus. Why look'st thou so? With my crossbow I shot the albatross." It is then that the curse befalls them all. Even though the south wind continues to drive them northward, the old sailor somehow senses that he has done a hellish thing, and that retribution will follow. That retribution comes in the form of anguish and alienation, not unlike that of Adam's when he fell from God's grace in the garden. The crew at first blames the sailor for his killing of the bird, for they feel the change in wind is a result of this misdeed. But when the ship emerges from the dreary fog and mist and continues peacefully on its way, they reverse their opinion. Perhaps the old man had been right to kill the bird after all. This change of mind binds them in guilt with the mariner. Yet this opinion is soon to change again, for as the ship continues north and reaches the equator, suddenly the wind ceases altogether, and they find themselves stationary on a calm sea. Days go by, and not the slightest breeze stirs. Now it is decided by all that an avenging spirit has followed their ship from the land of mist and snow, leaving them stranded and surrounded by undrinkable water. It's at this point in the poem that its three most famous stanzas appear. All in a hot and copper sky, the bloody sun at noon, right up above the mast did stand, no bigger than the moon. Day after day, day after day we stuck, nor breath nor motion, as idle as a painted ship upon a painted ocean. Water, water everywhere, and all the boards did shrink. Water, water everywhere, nor any drop to drink. In anger, the crew hangs the dead albatross around the sailor's neck as a symbol of his guilt. Time continues to pass until time has no meaning. The lips of the men bake and crack, and their eyes glaze over from thirst. The mariner says, "I looked to heaven and tried to pray, but or ever a prayer had gushed, a wicked whisper came, and made my heart as dry as dust." Then the sailors see a sight that fills them with joy. There is a speck on the horizon that can only be a ship. As the speck looms larger and nearer, they see it is indeed a ship, but now their joy has turned to terror, for this is no earthly ship. It moves along the water without even the merest breeze. The crew waits, wide-eyed and trembling with fear, as the skeleton ship approaches. It pulls alongside, and they can see two specters on board. One, a woman, who is life in death, and the other a man, her partner, death. The woman, life in death, is described this way. Her lips were red, her looks were free, her locks were yellow as gold, her skin was white as leprosy. The nightmare life in death was she, who thicks man's blood with cold. Life in death is playing dice with death to see who will win control of the ship. Death wins every throw for the ship's crew, but life in death wins the throw for the ancient mariner, and he is doomed to live on, to atone for his sins against nature. Then, as the sun drops into the sea and night descends on the silent waters, a ghastly scene is played out. One by one, each of the 200 crew members turns toward the mariner and, unable to speak, denounces him with a silent but telling stare, then drops dead upon the deck. As their souls fly from their bodies and speed past the seaman, the sound is like the whir of the crossbow when he'd shot the albatross. This image is so terrifying to the wedding guest that he feels sure the mariner is a ghost. "I fear thee, ancient mariner, I fear thy skinny hand, and thou art long and lank and brown as is the ribbed sea sand. I fear thee and thy glittering eye and thy skinny hand so brown." But the old man assures him he's mortal and continues with his story. As all his comrades lay dead around him, the mariner suffers deep agony. He moans, "That many men so beautiful, and they all dead did lie, and 1,000,000 slimy things lived on, and so did I." But these comments reveal that the mariner had not yet learned his lesson or become repentant, for it shows he still feels disgust for non-human life. For 7 days and 7 nights the mariner has to look upon the open, accusing eyes of his dead shipmates, whose bodies do not decay. He finds he can't take his eyes from them, and neither can he pray. His isolation is acute. Alone, alone, all alone, alone on a wide, wide sea, and never a saint took pity on my soul in agony. Finally, one night he stares out at the open, moonlit water, despondent and lonely, and notices sea snakes darting by. He is startled to behold their beauty, and at once feels a rush of love for these creatures, the only other living creatures in his wretched, cursed world. "Oh, happy living things!" he cries. And with that cry the spell is broken. He can finally pray, and the albatross slips from his neck and falls into the sea, where it sinks like lead. Exhausted and relieved, he falls into a deep sleep, only to be awakened later by rain, welcome, blessed rain, and his whole body drinks in the moisture. Now the seaman gazes into the heavens and sees strange sights he's never before witnessed. A fantastic array of colors and lights playing on the moon, the stars, and the water. Stranger still is what's happening on the deck. The bodies of his dead companions rise and begin to mutely go about their tasks of sailing, no longer transfixing him with their sightless stares. At this point in the story, the mariner explains to the wedding guest that the spirits which animated the bodies of the crew were not their own souls, which had fled at death, but a blessed troop of angelic spirits sent down by his guardian saint. He describes an encounter with one of the crew members, his own nephew. "The body of my brother's son stood by me, knee to knee. The body and I pulled at one rope, but he said naught to me." At sunrise the spirits depart, but the ship still sails on without help from any breeze. Now it's propelled by a spirit from the land of mist and snow, the polar spirit, still seeking repentance from the mariner for having killed the albatross. At noon the ship comes to a sudden halt, and then begins jerking back and forth in a bizarre tug of war. He wonders if death is once again trying to win his spirit. But the ship has reached the equator, and the polar spirit can no longer power it. It's being turned over to other forces. The ship leaps free from the invisible wrestlers, with such force that the sailor falls into a trance. He knows very little of what's happening until he hears the voices of 2 spirits. From their conversation he concludes the ship is now being powered by angelic forces, who hasten it northward at such speed that he couldn't have endured it in full consciousness. They have struck a bargain with the polar spirit, promising his repentance in exchange for the ship. When the sailor again awakens, dazed and astonished, it is night. The dead men again stand on the deck, the curse blazing anew in their eyes. But joy overtakes him when the spell finally breaks, and the ship continues to speed homeward. A strange wind blows. It has no sound, no motion. It blows in no direction, and it touches only the mariner. It raises his hair, fans his cheek, and mingles with his fears. At last he can see the dear, familiar landmarks he thought he would never see again. At first he thinks they are a vision, or that he sleeps and dreams. He prays that he might truly be awake. The angelic spirits depart from the bodies of the seamen, and standing atop each lifeless form is, in his words, a man all light, a seraph man, shining as would a rescue signal to the land. The angelic spirits wave a blessing to him and leave without a sound. Their silence, he says, sinks like music on his heart. A small pilot boat comes alongside the ship. A father and son are aboard, and also an old hermit of the woods, who is known for his singing of godly hymns. The mariner is glad to see the hermit. He will confess his sins to him and be cleansed. He is full of joy, but he knows also that he stands on a ship of which the deck is laden with dead men. On the pilot boat, the men talk of what they see. They can't understand why the bright lights they saw have been extinguished, or why the crew didn't respond to their greeting, why the wood of the ship is parched and buckled, and why the sails are dried and withered. The pilot is afraid of the fiendish look of the ship, but the hermit cheerfully tells him to push on, push on. Then a terrible noise rumbles through the water, splitting and sinking the ship, and sending the mariner overboard. The pilot falls down in his boat, shrieking. The pilot's boy becomes insane, for he thinks he is confronted with the devil. The hermit prays, and the mariner is thrown into the pilot's boat. His appearance shocks and terrifies everyone on board, for his gruesome adventure has left its mark, and he is ravaged. Once on land again, the mariner asks the holy hermit to bless him and cast off his sin. "What manner of man art thou?" asks the hermit, and he crosses himself. In answer, the mariner tells the hermit his entire story. Now the old seaman has concluded his story again, and he tells the wedding guest that ever since the hermit's blessing, he's been obliged to travel from land to land, never knowing when the agony of remembrance will recur. He will all of a sudden be seized by great physical pain that can only be relieved if he tells his story. When this happens, and the curse again darkens his soul, he recognizes the face of the man with whom he must share his message of love and reverence for God's creation. "I pass like night from land to land. I have strange power of speech. That moment that his face I see, I know the man that must hear me. To him my tale I teach." To these chosen men the mariner passes his message. "He prayeth well who loveth well both man and bird and beast. He prayeth best who loveth best all things both great and small. For the dear God who loveth us, he made and loveth all." The wedding guest is so moved by all that he has heard that when the old man vanishes, he departs also, missing the wedding, but feeling himself a sadder and wiser man. Thus the poem ends, offering us, right before that ending, a very simple and direct description of what most readers interpret to be the moral of the story. To pray well and to love well is to love all of God's creation and all of God's creatures. The reason for loving this creation and its creatures is because God loves them. This is the message that the Rime of the Ancient Mariner is famous for, this admonition to honor and blend with nature, to find the common link and join with all forms of life, and to be humble and compassionate enough to realize that each of those forms has value. The penalty for not learning this is loneliness and alienation from life and nature. For after he destroys the albatross, nature becomes a strange and antagonistic force, and the mariner is separated by symbolic death from life and companionship. This is why some readers associate the killing of the albatross with the original sin. For as soon as the mariner betrays God's command to love, he is doomed to a living hell and has lost his right to paradise. Before he committed his terrible deed, the sailor and his crew were in harmonious relationship with the universe. They had been blown south, but they had survived the storm undamaged, and had successfully made their way through the ice. The albatross came to play with them, and took on religious significance too, for he participates in their evening prayers, whether in mist or cloud, on mast or shroud. When the mariner kills the albatross, he commits a crime against nature, and the guilty offender must then suffer the punishment of an offended universe. His mates must suffer too, for weak in faith, they too turned against the albatross for one fatal moment, and declared it was right to have killed him, for he was a bad omen. By the time they realize this assessment is wrong, it's too late. There are many people who think the poem is also a projection of the author's own guilt and fears, for he felt, among other things, that he'd failed at his art, and that his addiction to opium was a cursed weakness. It's always impossible to tell exactly how much of a poet is in his poem, but it seems likely that Coleridge did experience what felt like an unpredictable, uncontrollable universe, and that this conflicted with the harmonious universe he sought and proclaimed. Coleridge's own comments indicate that the real moral of the poem, or at least another moral, is that humans are subject to forces beyond themselves, over which they have no control or power. In The Ancient Mariner, nature represents that force, as do the angelic forces and the polar spirit, both of whom meet and decide what the mariner's fate will be. In addition, the scene in which death and life in death are casting dice to determine who wins the fate of the crew and the seamen seems to point to a rather arbitrary and somewhat capricious universe. But that caprice is matched by the mariners, who shot the albatross impulsively, hardly knowing why he did it himself. He shot, and he was exiled for life. Capricious decisions about life and death are made on both parts, by man and by the universe. The mariner may not have control over these supernatural forces, but then he doesn't have control over himself either, since he can't even summon up enough love of God's creation to prevent himself from killing an innocent and friendly resident of that creation. Coleridge was aware of those dark dimensions of the human soul. He wrote about them in many works, and looked within himself to scrutinize them. In many ways, people have thought the mariner actually represents the poet, or any poet, since his solitude, his wanderings, his internal agony and loneliness are typical of the poet's life. Poets also see and hear what others do not, and they see and hear it in a way that is different and strange to others, a description which can also be applied to the mariner, particularly by the end of the story. In this interpretation of the poem, the albatross then is seen as creative imagination. However, in other interpretations, he is seen as a symbol of redemption and of Christ, since the sailors first greet him as if greeting a Christian soul, and since he's hung around the neck of the mariner in a way reminiscent of Christ bearing his cross. None or all of these interpretations may be correct, for they don't necessarily contradict each other. What's important about the poem, and what makes it great and enduring, besides its beauty and haunting images, is that it's rich, deep, and provocative enough to inspire so many interpretations and ideas, that it can reflect and awaken what is most relevant and profound in each of us. That, in itself, is what defines a classic work of literature.
This is the end of the session.